everyone, welcome to Study Smart Innovations. Today we are going to dive into something super exciting. We are going to build a REST API using Java Spring Boot in less than 15 minutes. Whether you are a beginner or looking for a refresher, this course has you covered. Without any delay, let's get started. Before starting, I would request you to subscribe the channel because you are going to get something valuable out of here that would help in your tech career. Before we jump into code, let's quickly understand what is a REST API. REST or Representational State Transfer is a way to communicate between systems over HTTP. It is the backbone of most modern web and mobile applications. Now CRUD, create, read, update and delete, represents the core operations we perform on data. Think of it as the basic language for interacting with databases. We will start by setting up our Spring Boot project. We are going to head towards the Spring Initializr that would help to set up the initial Spring Boot project. Now in the Spring Initializr, we have to select the Maven and we have to select the language as Java. Select the Spring Boot latest version, the stable one. Try to avoid the snapshot ones because they are less stable. And in the dependencies, we have to add the Spring Wave and Spring Dev Tools. Two dependencies is just sufficient for right now. And then in the project metadata, you have to add the project name and other informations, metadata stuffs. So I am giving here SSIC and the artifact to be Spring Boot dot tutorial maybe. And so this name is actually used for all the jar building stuff and where this name would be utilized. So you have to give some meaningful, that is conveying what this project is all about. Now then generate the project and you would get downloaded Spring Boot tutorial zip, that is the code base, initialized code base with all the dependencies you want. Then import that in your most favorite IDE and then start coding. Upon importing that project, that would look something like this in the IDE. Now we have to create the model first. Now inside this Java Spring Boot tutorial package, now I would want to create a sub package with the name model. Now inside that model, we are going to create that class that is going to serve as a model. That would be user. Now this user model would define the structure of our data. So we are going to have three fields: a ID, a name, and an email field. And we have a noargs constructor, we have a parameterized constructor, and we have getter and setter functions that would help us to get and set the attributes. Next, we would create our mock repository. Now to keep things simple, we are using a in-memory repository. The name of the repository would be user repository. Now similarly, we have to create a new package. Inside that base package, name that as repository. And inside repository, we would create a class called the user repository. The user repository class will be used to store our users in a list and provide methods to save, retrieve, and find the users by ID. You can see we have an array list users and we have a couple of methods that would help us to find the users, save a new user, or find a user by ID. We have used a lambda expression here that would create a stream out of that list object and filter based on that ID parameter. Whatever ID we are passing as a param here, if it matches with the user object's ID, then that user would be find first and then that we would get as a user object returned. But if you don't get any matching ID with the ID you have passed as a param here, then you are going to get null, right? Or else it's null. So here this lambda expression smartly handles the matching case and returns you that user that matches with the ID. Now next we have to create the controller. Similarly, we have to create a new package named controller. Why I am creating packages is creating a defined repository structure. This is very important when you are going to deal with large repositories, then that is going to help you a lot. The name of the controller would be user controller, and here the magic happens. The user controller would be used to interact with our repository, and for instance, a get request retrieves all users, while a post request adds a new user. So the code something looks like this. We have a @rest controller here, and we have a request mapping /API/users. So when we are going to launch the server, then at the localhost colon 8080 /API/users, we are going to serve the requests. So we have a get endpoint here in this URL. So this would just return all the users that we have in a list as JSON array. Now in the post mapping, we have on the same URL, but this would create an user. So in the body, if we pass a JSON would be something looking like that user object only, then that user would be saved in that repository. And ultimately that would be saved inside this array list. Now that when it's saved successfully, then we have to return a message to the user, right? To show that we have added successfully. So here is the response that we are going to get returned. And the last one is /id. So on this path, if we have an ID passed from that Postman or whatever client we have, then we are going to match this ID with the list of users that we have, and if it matches, we would return the valid user. If not, we would return null. Now we are going to run this application. Now to run, you go to the main class and then hit this play button, or you can also run a maven command, maven spring boot run. So I can also run it by right clicking and making it run with the help of run application.main. Then automatically it would spin up the Tomcat server embedded one inside Spring Boot. You can see the server is getting launched. We have a Tomcat embedded server here. Our application has started. Now next we would test the API. Now our server has started and we are in localhost 8080 port. That is the default port of all Spring Boot services that are being deployed. So now after that we have the /API/users. We are going to test the first URL, that endpoint that we have created, that is a get method. So on this URL, if we hit the get method, then we are going to get nothing, because now our array list doesn't have anything. You can see the status is okay, but we are getting a null, empty array rather. So we have to put some data, right? Now if we change the endpoint to post, and in the body I have added a JSON object. So this is the JSON equivalent to that user class, right? We had UID, we had a name field, we have an email field, right? Now if we hit the send, then we would see that message, the user created successfully, that we had in the controller, right? So the user has got added. Now if I add another user, maybe a user 3, and instead of Robert, make it as John, then hit the send button, and then we are going to see a user created successfully. So we have added now 2 users, right? Now if we change that endpoint to get and then hit, then we are going to get a response of the array of that JSON objects, whatever we have in that array list, right? So we have 2 users now. So now we got returned that 2 users. Those 2 users are returned. One is the John Doe, another is the Robert Doe. This was the post endpoint and the get endpoint. So create and read is done. Now there is a special read case. So here is a /API/users. Now if we pass that ID, so we have a user with ID 2, right? So we are going to get returned this one, Robert Doe 1, right? Let's try. So it's a get request with this URL, with this path parameter ID as 2. Now we are hitting the send button and we are getting a status OK 200 response, and the JSON object is that corresponding to Robert Doe, right? If we make it 3, then what we are going to get? We are going to get John Doe. Now we are going to get null because this ID doesn't reside in the array list, right? We don't have any users with this ID. So what it would return? It is returning nothing as null. So we are not getting to see anything because we have not handled that in our code correctly. We have passed as null. So this is a case for error handling. But for now, this is simple and basic structure of REST API that we have built and tested. So in just 15 minutes, we have built a fully functional REST API with Spring Boot. This is just the beginning, and there is so much more you can add, like database integration, authentication. And if you found this tutorial helpful, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to get more tutorials.
I have put up this tutorial in the form of a blog in my website onlinestudysmart.com where you would get all the detailed steps and the information about REST API, CRUD operations, and the required prerequisites that you need. I have documented the steps in a very lucid manner, very simple. You can refer, study, get the code, and you can do your hands on coding just for reference. And at the end, I have also put up the GitHub code where I have put this basic code also. You can also refer to that, download or clone, or you can also do some alterations. For today, Tata and happy coding. Meet you in the next video.